Most people don't wake up one day and decide to accept poor treatment. It happens slowly. Someone speaks to you in a way that stings, and you say nothing. A person crosses a boundary you never voiced, and you let it go. Over time, that silence becomes your default. You stop feeling the sting. You start calling it patience. You start calling it maturity. But what you may actually be doing is tolerating something that is slowly wearing you down. Not because you are strong, but because you are trained to be quiet. If this kind of thinking helps you, consider subscribing to this channel. We go deep on Stoic wisdom, not to impress anyone, but to build the kind of inner life that holds up under real pressure. Hit the like button if this is the kind of content you want more of. Now let's get into it. Number 1, you apologize when you should not. There's a behavior that many people carry without ever questioning it. The reflex of apologizing when they have done nothing wrong. Someone raises their voice at you, and you say sorry. Someone is rude in a meeting, and you find yourself softening your own words to reduce the tension they created. This is not kindness. This is not humility. The Stoics understood the difference clearly. Epictetus, who was born a slave and lived under conditions of extreme powerlessness, never confused submission with virtue. He wrote about the importance of knowing what belongs to you, your judgment, your response, your sense of what is true. Apologizing when you have done nothing wrong is an act of giving your judgment away. It is surrendering your inner territory to keep peace on the surface. The reason this pattern forms is not weakness of character. It usually starts early. A child who grew up in an environment where conflict felt dangerous learned that apologizing makes things calm down fast. The apology becomes a survival tool. It reduces tension and confrontations, restores a surface peace that felt necessary at the time. The brain logs this as effective behavior. By adulthood, that same person apologizes automatically, not because they feel remorse, but because their nervous system has learned that it is the fastest way to make discomfort stop. The Stoic tradition would call this a conditioned response rather than a reasoned one. And reason, for the Stoics, was the highest human faculty. Living by conditioned reflex rather than reason is living below your capacity. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the importance of pausing before responding, not because he was slow, but because he understood that the immediate impulse is rarely the clearest one. When you pause and ask yourself why you're about to apologize, you often find that the real reason is not guilt but discomfort. You want the other person to feel better. You want the air to clear. You want to be liked or seen as reasonable. These are understandable desires, but they are not reasons to issue a false statement. An apology that does not reflect genuine remorse is a lie told for comfort. And when you lie in this way repeatedly, you begin to distort your own sense of what happened. You start to genuinely believe you were in the wrong because you said so many times that you were. The long-term cost of this pattern is significant. When you apologize reflexively, other people learn that you will take responsibility even when you should not. This is not a judgment of their character. It is simply how conditioning works on both sides. If someone learns that you will apologize when pressured, pressure becomes a useful tool for them. They do not need to examine their own behavior because you will absorb it. Relationships built on this dynamic are unbalanced by design. One person carries the emotional weight of maintaining peace, while the other person is never required to develop restraint or self-awareness. The Stoics would recognize this as a failure of justice, not the legal kind, but the personal kind that governs how people treat one another in daily life. Seneca wrote about the value of self-examination as a nightly practice. He would review his day and ask himself where he had acted well and where he had fallen short. This is a radically honest exercise, but it cuts both ways. It means being honest when you were wrong, and equally honest when you were not. If you examine your day and find that you apologize for something you did not do, that is worth noting. It is information. It tells you that the conditioned reflex is still running, still spending your integrity on situations that do not require it. Self-examination of this kind is not self-criticism. It is self-knowledge. And self-knowledge, for the Stoics, was the foundation of every other virtue. Recovering from this pattern does not require confrontation or declarations. It requires a quieter and more demanding thing: the ability to sit with the discomfort of not apologizing and let the air stay tense for a moment. Most people have never practiced this. They have always moved to resolve the tension as fast as possible. Sitting with it, not reactively, not coldly, but calmly, is a form of Stoic practice. It teaches you that the discomfort does not destroy anything. The other person's disappointment does not erase you. Their irritation passes. And on the other side of that experience, you begin to find that your sense of self is more solid than you thought. You can hold your ground without hostility. That is not stubbornness. That is self-possession. Number 2, you minimize your own pain to make others comfortable. There's a quiet habit that many people develop over years of navigating difficult relationships. The habit of making their own pain small so that others do not have to sit with the discomfort of having caused it. Someone says something cutting. Someone dismisses your effort or talks over you in front of others. And your immediate response, even internally, is to reduce it. It's not a big deal. They probably didn't mean it that way. I'm being too sensitive. This minimizing is presented to yourself as perspective, as maturity, as not making things bigger than they are. But for many people, it is none of those things. It is a trained response, a way of protecting the other person from accountability by erasing the evidence of harm. The Stoic tradition has a precise and important concept here: the difference between what is in our control and what is not. Pain is real. It is a signal. The Stoics never suggested that we pretend signals do not exist. What they suggested was that we decide consciously how to respond to them. Minimizing your pain is not a Stoic response. It is an avoidance response. The Stoic response would be to acknowledge what happened clearly, that was dismissive and it affected me, and then decide what, if anything, to do about it. The acknowledgement is internal and honest. It does not require dramatic expression, but it is real. Skipping the acknowledgement entirely and jumping straight to "it's fine" is a form of self-abandonment dressed up as emotional maturity. People who do this consistently often notice a particular kind of exhaustion that is hard to explain. They are not working too hard physically. They're not in obvious distress. But there's a tiredness that settles in after conversations that should have been neutral or even pleasant. This tiredness is the result of the cognitive and emotional labor of constant minimizing. Every time you reduce your own experience to make space for someone else's comfort, you spend energy. You spend the energy of evaluation, suppression, reframing. Over time, this becomes the background noise of your inner life, a constant low-level process of making yourself smaller so that relationships remain smooth. The Stoics would recognize this as a misuse of the faculty of reason. You are using your mind not to pursue wisdom or clarity, but to manage other people's emotions at the expense of your own. Marcus Aurelius wrote about how the rational mind, when functioning well, perceives things as they actually are, not as we wish them to be or fear them to be, but as they are. This is a demanding standard. It means that seeing clearly is a practice, not a personality trait. Some people have trained themselves through years of emotional survival to see their own pain as smaller than it is. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a very intelligent adaptation to a specific kind of environment. But that environment may no longer be present. The adaptation may now be operating in places where it no longer serves you. The Stoic practice of clear perception asks you to look at what is actually happening, including what is happening inside you, and call it by its right name. One of the more difficult aspects of this pattern is that it often gets praised by the people around you. You are described as easygoing, low maintenance, not dramatic. These are presented as compliments, and they feel good in the moment. But they are, in part, rewards for self-erasure. When people praise you for never making a fuss, they are also telling you that they prefer you when you take up less space. That preference may be comfortable for them, but it is not neutral for you. Epictetus was deeply suspicious of praise that came from others, because he understood that seeking it pulls you away from your own judgment and toward theirs. If you're being praised for minimizing your pain, ask yourself what the praise is actually rewarding, and ask yourself whether that reward is worth the price. The path out of this pattern is not to start expressing every pain loudly or to catalog offenses and present them to others. It is simpler and harder than that. It is to develop the habit of honest internal acknowledgement before any decision about expression. Something happens. You feel something. You name it to yourself. Not to perform it, not to use it as leverage, but simply as an act of truthfulness. That hurt. That was unfair. I did not deserve that. These are small, quiet, private statements, but they are significant because they interrupt the automatic process of minimizing. They create a moment of contact with your own experience before the habit kicks in. Over time, that moment of contact becomes more natural and the automatic minimizing becomes less automatic. That is the beginning of standing on your own ground. Number 3, you feel responsible for other people's moods. One of the most exhausting forms of psychological conditioning is the belief that you are responsible for how other people feel, and that when someone in your life is upset, angry, withdrawn, or disappointed, it is your job to fix it. This belief rarely announces itself directly. It operates quietly through a constant background monitoring of the emotional temperature of everyone around you. You walk into a room and immediately scan for signs of tension. You notice a shift in someone's tone and immediately begin running through a list of things you might have done wrong. You adjust your behavior, your words, your posture, all in an attempt to bring the room back to neutral. This is not empathy. Empathy is the ability to recognize and understand another person's experience. What this is a form of compulsive emotional management that treats other people's inner states as problems you are responsible for solving. The Stoic framework draws one of its most important distinctions exactly here. The dichotomy of control, the idea that some things are within our power and some things are not, applies directly to the emotional states of other people. Someone else's mood is not in your control. Their reaction is not in your control. Their disappointment, their frustration, their satisfaction, none of these are yours to manage. Epictetus is direct about this. He says that the things which are not up to us are not our concern in the sense that they cannot be made different through our effort alone. What is in our control is our own response, our own judgment, our own character. When you try to manage someone else's emotional state, you are pouring your energy into a domain that is fundamentally outside your power. The result is always the same: exhaustion without resolution. People who carry this pattern often describe a feeling of being responsible for a room's atmosphere in a way that other people simply do not seem to feel. They notice it particularly with certain individuals, a parent, a partner, a close colleague, where the other person's emotional state seems to expand and fill all available space, and the person carrying this pattern automatically shrinks and adjusts to accommodate it. This dynamic has a name in psychology, but the Stoics would simply describe it as a confusion between what is yours and what belongs to someone else. When you absorb someone else's mood as your problem, you have accepted a burden that was never yours to carry. And because you cannot actually control their mood, you will always fail to solve it, which means you will always feel inadequate, always feel like you haven't done enough. There's a specific kind of relationship where this pattern is most visible and most damaging. The relationship with someone who has learned, consciously or not, to use their emotional state as a form of pressure. Their displeasure becomes a signal that you must do something. Their silence is loaded with expectation. Their frustration is treated implicitly as your failure. In these relationships, The person carrying the conditioning works harder and harder to maintain emotional equilibrium, while the other person contributes less and less, because the conditioning person has taken over the work. Marcus Aurelius wrote about dealing with difficult people by remembering that they act from their own nature and their own understanding. This is not an excuse for their behavior, but it is a release from the belief that their behavior is a reflection of you or a problem you caused. Seneca wrote about the importance of tending to your own inner life as the primary work of a human being, not the management of others, not the maintenance of social harmony, not the constant labor of keeping everyone comfortable, but the cultivation of your own reason, your own values, your own steadiness. When you spend your inner life managing other people's emotions, you are not doing this primary work. Your attention is constantly outward, constantly scanning, constantly adjusting. The inner life, the place where real Stoic development happens, goes unattended. This is one of the hidden costs of emotional over-responsibility. It crowds out the time and attention you would otherwise use to actually know yourself and develop your own character. Breaking this pattern is uncomfortable in a particular way. When you stop automatically managing someone's mood, there is usually a period where that mood gets worse before anything improves. The person has learned to expect the management. When it stops, they feel the difference. They may express that difference in ways that feel like confirmation that you did something wrong. This is the most important moment in the process. Sitting through that discomfort without reverting, without rushing back to soothe, fix, or adjust, is the practice. It is genuinely hard, but it is also clarifying because it shows you what the relationship actually requires of you versus what you have been volunteering. And from that clearer ground, you can make more honest decisions about how much to give and what you actually want to receive. Number 4, you confuse familiar with safe. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. The brain does not evaluate situations purely on their merit. It evaluates them in comparison to what it already knows. This is efficient in most contexts, but it creates a specific and important problem. Familiar things feel safe even when they are not. A person who grew up in a home where disrespect was normal will not experience disrespect in adulthood the way someone else would. It will not register as alarm. It will register as ordinary. It will feel on some level like home. This is not a character flaw. It is a neurological reality. But understanding it is essential, because when familiar and safe become confused, a person can remain in genuinely harmful situations for a very long time. Not because they cannot leave, but because their internal alarm system does not fire. The Stoics placed enormous value on the faculty of judgment, the ability to assess a situation accurately and respond accordingly. Epictetus described the undisciplined mind as one that is swept along by first impressions, accepting them as true without examination. The person who is confused familiar with safe is doing exactly this. They receive the impression of a situation, this is normal, and accept it without asking whether normal and good are the same thing. They are not. A situation could be entirely normal by the standards of your experience and still be causing you measurable harm. Stoic practice requires that we examine our impressions before acting on them. This includes the deep impressions laid down early in life about what treatment is acceptable and what is not. One of the ways this confusion manifests is in the patterns people seek out in adult relationships. Research in psychology has consistently shown that people tend to replicate the emotional dynamics of their early relationships. Not because they want to be hurt, but because familiar dynamics feel legible. You know the rules. You know what to expect. You know on some level how to navigate it. A completely different dynamic, one built on genuine respect, consistency, and care, can feel strange or even unsettling at first. Not because it is worse, but because it is unfamiliar. This is the cruel efficiency of conditioning. It can make the harmful feel comfortable and the healthy feel foreign. Marcus Aurelius returned, throughout his writings, to the theme of self-correction. He recognized that his own judgments and habits were imperfect, and he committed to examining them continuously rather than treating them as fixed. This is not a posture of self-doubt or self-criticism. It is an active, ongoing inquiry into whether your operating assumptions are actually serving you. For someone who has confused familiar with safe, this kind of inquiry is essential. It means asking, without self-judgment, is this situation acceptable because I have evaluated it carefully, or is it acceptable because it resembles something I grew up with? The answer to that question changes things. Not because familiarity is always wrong, but because familiarity alone is not a sufficient reason to accept something. There is a particular moment that many people describe when this confusion begins to lift. It usually comes not from a dramatic event, but from a quiet conversation, often with someone who simply treats them differently. A person who has only known dismissive communication encounters someone who listens without interrupting. A person accustomed to criticism encounters someone who gives honest feedback without cruelty. The contrast is surprising in a way that is difficult to explain. It is not that the person did not know better treatment existed in the abstract. It is that they did not know what it felt like in their body. That physical surprise is important information. It is the nervous system registering a discrepancy between what was familiar and what is actually possible. The Stoic path forward from this confusion is not to reject everything familiar and seek out entirely new environments, though sometimes that is necessary. It is to develop a more reliable internal standard, one built on your own reason values rather than your accumulated history of what has been normal. Seneca wrote that we should evaluate our lives against reason and truth, not against what we have inherited or what others around us are doing. This is the work, building a clear, internally held sense of what respect actually looks like in practice, what kindness actually feels like, what consistency and care actually require, and then using that standard to evaluate your current circumstances honestly. When the standard is internal and reasoned, it is no longer vulnerable to the distortions of conditioning. It is yours. Number 5, you have learned to earn the respect that should be given freely. There is a pattern that is so deeply embedded in some people's way of living that they rarely question it. The belief that respect must be earned through constant performance, not earned once through demonstrated character, which is a reasonable standard, but earned continuously in every interaction through behavior that meets an ever-moving target. These people over-explain. They over-prepare. They do more than was asked in order to justify taking up space. They preemptively apologize for requests. They hedge their opinions before stating them. They soften disagreements so thoroughly that the disagreement barely registers. All of this is driven by an underlying assumption that their basic worth is not guaranteed, that they are one misstep away from having it withdrawn. This is not humility. This is the psychological residue of having been treated as though your value was conditional. The Stoics understood worth very differently. For Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca alike, the value of a human being was located in their rational nature, the capacity for reason, judgment, and virtue that every person carries. This value was not earned through performance. It was not granted by others. It was inherent in the nature of what a human being is. This is not a feel-good abstraction. It has practical implications. If your worth is inherent, then the respect that basic worth warrants is not something you should need to constantly earn. It is something that should exist as a baseline in any relationship you choose to invest in. When someone in your life regularly requires you to perform for basic acknowledgement, the problem is not that you have not performed well enough. The problem is that the baseline is wrong. This pattern often becomes most visible in professional settings. A person carries deeply ingrained conditioning around earning respect and brings it into the workplace. They take on extra work without asking for recognition. They accept credit being given to others without correcting the record. They do not negotiate their worth at contract time because they feel it would be presumptuous. They are skilled, reliable, and consistently under-acknowledged. And they interpret this not as a systemic failure, but as a personal one. I just need to do more. I just need to prove myself more thoroughly. The Stoics would recognize this as a misdirection of effort. The effort is real and admirable, but it is being invested in a system that has already demonstrated it will not return fair value. That is not a rational investment. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the danger of seeking external validation, of needing the approval of others to feel settled in your own sense of self. He called this a form of enslavement, not to a person, but to their opinions. When you require someone's respect in order to feel that you deserve it, you have given that person enormous power over your inner life. They do not need to do anything dramatic with that power. They simply need to be inconsistent, sometimes acknowledging you, sometimes not, and you will spend enormous energy trying to understand what you did wrong and how to regain their approval. This is the mechanism at the heart of this pattern. The person who withholds respect inconsistently holds more power over you than the person who is simply and openly disrespectful. Inconsistency keeps you trying. Seneca wrote that a person who truly knows their own worth is not moved by praise or stung by dismissal in the deep way that a person of uncertain self-regard is. This is the goal of Stoic practice in this domain. Not indifference to others, but sufficiency within yourself. The difference is significant. An indifferent person does not care what anyone thinks. A self-sufficient person cares about their relationships and about being seen clearly, but they do not need the validation to feel whole. This internal sufficiency is not arrogance. It is the product of genuine self-examination and honest self-knowledge. You know what you're actually like. You know your effort, your values, your actual record. That knowledge does not depend on someone else confirming it. The most practical shift that comes from working through this pattern is in how you choose and evaluate relationships. When you no longer need to earn basic respect, you stop mistaking high-effort maintenance for deep connection. Some relationships require constant work because they are genuinely complex and valuable. Others require constant work because one person in the relationship does not offer baseline respect without it being extracted through effort. From the outside, these can look similar. Both involve effort, both feel serious. But the internal experience is different. One leaves you feeling seen and engaged. The other leaves you feeling assessed and uncertain. The Stoics believe that clear perception of reality is the starting point for every right action. Seeing clearly which kind of relationship you are in is the first and most important step toward living in a way that honors your own worth.